The movie begins in Texas, where a group of shackled, enslaved black people walks through the desert, escorted by the brothers Ace and Dickie. It's 1858, 2 years before the Civil War. Django, one of the enslaved people, was separated from his wife, Broomhilde von Schaft, after being sold. Their journey is interrupted at night by Dr. King Schultz, a German dentist turned bounty hunter. Ace becomes enraged and demands to know Schultz's business, threatening him. Schultz explains he's looking for Django to help him find the Brittle brothers, whom Django knows. Schultz asks if anyone was from Kerrigan Plantation, where Django can be found. After Django confirms, Schultz illuminates the faces with his lamp to find him. Django reveals information about the Brittle brothers, former overseers at Kerrigan Plantation. Schultz asks if Django can identify them, but Ace interrupts and warns Schultz. Schultz tries to calm the situation, but Ace refuses to sell Django. When Ace threatens Schultz, he shoots Ace and Dickie's horse. Dickie is trapped under the horse, and Schultz sarcastically apologizes before approaching Dickie. However, Schultz advises against any rash actions until Dickie calms down. Despite Dickie's frustration, Schultz remains calm and asks him to keep quiet so he can finish talking to Django. Returning to Django, Schultz insists on paying a fair price for Django's help in identifying the Brittle brothers. He leaves the other enslaved people to deal with Dickie while Django takes Ace's coat and horse. The next day, Django and Schultz arrive in Daughtry, Texas, drawing attention as Django, a black man, rides a horse, a rare sight. They inadvertently acquire a bar and restaurant when the innkeeper flees at the sight of Django with Schultz. Schultz reveals his plan to become a bounty hunter who deals in corpses, as slave trading deals in human lives for profit. His job involves transporting the bodies of slain enslaved people to authorities to collect a bounty. Even though Schultz abhors slavery, he sees an opportunity in Django's desire for revenge. He agrees to help Django kill the Brittle brothers in exchange for Django's freedom and $75. As they travel, Schultz learns that Django is married and intends to find and free his wife, Broomhilde, who was raised by Germans and speaks some German. She works as a house slave for the von Schaft family. They head to Tennessee, where Django plans to pose as a valet to gain access to the plantation. Schultz allows Django to choose his disguise. They visit Spencer Big Daddy Bennett's plantation and negotiate to purchase one of his enslaved people. Big Daddy agrees, giving Schultz the chance to order his enslaved person to lead Django around the plantation. While touring the plantation, Django asks Bettina about the Brittle brothers, but she doesn't know them. She mentions the Schaffers, who visited the plantation in past years. Unintentionally, she points out Ellis Brittle in the field and mentions the other two Brittles at the stable. Django quickly goes to the stable and orders Bettina to fetch Schultz. Django kills John and beats Raj after he fights back. He shoots Raj when Schultz arrives, asking for the names of the two he killed. Django directs Schultz to Ellis, allowing Schultz to shoot him without hesitation. Later that night, despite having a warrant earlier, Big Daddy attempts to attack Django and Schultz with a posse. They fail to convince him of the consequences for assaulting an officer of the court. Schultz ambushes the posse with explosives hidden in his cart, hitting the carriage accurately and providing Django with a sniper to take down Big Daddy. After the ambush, Django and Schultz spend the night eating, during which Django talks about his wife. Schultz shares the story he knows about Broomhilde to entertain Django. Feeling responsible for Django, Schultz expresses his reluctance to let Django go to Greenville alone to rescue Broomhilde. He proposes that Django join him in bounty hunting to earn money to buy her freedom. Django accepts Schultz's offer to work together through the winter and receive a third of Schultz's bounties afterward. Schultz agrees to help Django, promising to take him to Greenville and locate where the Germans sent Broomhilde. The next day, Django and Schultz return to Texas and begin their first mission, where Django kills Smitty Bacall and keeps his handbell as a memento, earning his first bounty. Django practices shooting using a snowman target, and they continue to rack up rewards over the winter, killing suspects without struggle. Later, they travel to Mississippi and witness many enslaved black people on the streets. They discover that Broomhilda's new owner is Calvin J. Candy, who owns the fourth largest cotton plantation in Mississippi, called Candyland. Schultz, feeling desperate, discusses how they can rescue Broomhilda from Calvin. Instead of buying a horse, Schultz suggests they buy a farm. He plans for Django to pose as an expert Mandingo fighter, a wealthy buyer from Dusseldorf, to enter the Mandingo fight game. Calvin forces his slaves to engage in brutal Mandingo fights to the death. Django and Schultz meet Calvin at his gentleman's club, where Calvin watches the Mandingo fights while Django refuses to participate. Schultz tries to negotiate with Calvin to buy one of his best fighters, using it as a pretext to acquire Broomhilda for a nominal sum, since Calvin refuses to sell her. They catch Calvin's attention and receive an invitation to Candyland. The next day, Schultz warns Django not to act recklessly if he wants to see his wife, as they encounter Calvin's slave trackers, who have cornered D'Artagnan, an escapee Mandingo fighter, using their dogs. Despite D'Artagnan's pleas, Calvin orders him to be subdued and brought to him for discussion. Unfortunately, Calvin realizes that his fighter lost the last fight and humiliates him by questioning his understanding of reimbursement. Schultz tries to intervene by offering to reimburse the fighter, but Django stops him to avoid blowing their cover. Calvin then orders the tracker dogs to kill D'Artagnan, leaving Schultz no choice but to watch him be mauled to death. They proceed to Candyland as if nothing happened. Calvin is surprised to see Django riding a horse with Schultz and learns that Django is a freeman. Calvin instructs his staff to treat them well. Schultz asks Calvin to clean up Broomhilda's name so he can meet her. Django, overhearing Broomhilda's mistreatment, struggles to restrain himself. Realizing he needs to stay calm to save his wife, Django watches Broomhilda crying as she cleans up. Later that night, Laura Lee brings Broomhilda to Schultz's room to speak. Schultz reassures Broomhilda in German, assuming Calvin's slavers understand English. He outlines their plan to rescue her and secures an agreement to buy her during dinner. Confused, Broomhilda asks about Django's identity, and Django reveals himself to her. During dinner that night, Schultz works to persuade Calvin to accept their deal. However, Stephen, Calvin's suspicious head house slave, notices Broomhilda's reaction to Laura Lee's comments about Django. Sensing trouble, Stephen alerts Calvin to the fact that Broomhilda knows Django, prompting Schultz and Django to realize that their plan is compromised. Laura Lee inadvertently helps Django keep his composure amidst the tension. Calvin instructs everyone to leave the dining area so he can speak with Django, Schultz, and his lawyer. He reveals their plan to buy Broomhilda and orders Stephen to bring her out, physically hurting her in the process. Calvin changes the deal at gunpoint, demanding $12,000 for Broomhilda, instead of Eskimo Joe, the fighter. Reluctantly, Schultz agrees, but when Calvin threatens to harm Broomhilda with a hammer, Schultz refuses to comply. He hands over the money, but when Calvin continues to threaten Broomhilda, Schultz shoots Calvin dead. In retaliation, Butch Pooch kills Schultz, prompting Django to retaliate by shooting Pooch, Calvin's lawyer, and several henchmen. Django engages in a gunfight, but surrenders when he sees Broomhilda taken hostage by Stephen and Calvin's henchmen, Billy Crash. The next day, Django is tortured by Billy, nearly castrating him. Stephen arrives and informs Django that Laura Lee wants to see him. Laura Lee decides to spare Django from castration, but sells him to the LeQuint Dickey Mining Company, condemning him to suffer to death in the mines. Minutes later, Django is on his way to meet his new owner's company when he devises an escape plan. He attempts to talk with his escort, showing them his first handbill to prove he's a bounty hunter. Desperate to escape, Django fabricates lies, claiming that the men on his handbill are at Candyland, and promises to share the reward money with his escorts. Luckily, Django convinces his escorts to release him with the help of his fellow enslaved men. After his guards hand over rifles and dynamite to him, Django kills them and returns to Candyland with dynamite in hand. He enters the place on horseback, first eliminating the trackers at their base, then proceeding to the barn to retrieve Broomhilda's freedom papers from Schultz's corpse. The movie concludes with Django bidding farewell to Schultz by tapping his head, vowing to avenge him and D'Artagnan, who died from Calvin's slave dogs. Django heads straight to the shelter where Broomhilda is imprisoned. Fortunately, Django seizes the opportunity to save Broomhilda, while Calvin's mourners return from his burial to pay their respects. Later that night, Django exacts his revenge by killing Lara, Crash, and the henchmen who returned from the mansion after mourning Calvin's death. Django then instructs the two remaining enslaved women to bid farewell to Laura Lee. However, Stephen attempts to stop Django from leaving. Despite Stephen's efforts, Django kneecaps him and ignites the dynamite he planted around the mansion. He ignores Stephen's cries as the explosives detonate, engulfing the mansion in flames. Django and Broomhilda watch from a distance as the mansion explodes and then ride off together on horseback. As a result of his actions, Django becomes known as the fastest gun in the South.